What if he thought your salts came from one Scottish general who was laughed at, dismissed as soft, and he died thinking he'd failed? What if he thought that the entire way modern soldiers are trained from the Susty Navy old you? His radical idea was simply this: soldiers are stupid. It's ke-1799. Britain is getting absolutely battered. Napoleon Bonaparte is steamrolling every army Europe throws at him. The French have worked out a completely new way of fighting. Their soldiers don't stand in rigid lines like Thai soldiers anymore. They spread out. They think for themselves. They move through terrain like wolves on the hunt. Meanwhile, British soldiers, still being trained like it's ke-1650. They march in straight lines. They fire only when commanded. Step out of line. You get beaten with achane, question and order. That's a flogging offense. They're treated like machines, not men. And they're dying because of it. The British army is desperate. They've tried everything: better muskets, more artillery, stricter discipline. Nothing works because they're fighting tomorrow's war with yesterday's tactics. Then a Scottish general named John Moore stands up in a meeting and he says something that sounds like treason. He says British soldiers aren't stupid. He says they should be taught to read, to think, to make decisions on their own, to understand why they're fighting, not just how. The room goes silent. In an army where soldiers are flogged for the tiniest infractions, where thinking for yourself is considered dangerous, where the entire system is built on rigid obedience, Moore is suggesting something unthinkable. He's suggesting soldiers should be treated like human beings. Most of the generals laugh him out of the room, but a few don't, because deep down, they know he's right. They know that in the forests of Europe, in the mountains of Spain, in the chaos of real combat, rigid obedience gets men killed. What saves lives is initiative, adaptation, intelligence. And John Moore is about to prove it. Now, Moore isn't some armchair theorist. He's seen combat across the globe. He fought in America during the Revolution. He served in the West Indies where disease killed more men than bullets. He battled in Corsica where he lost an eye leading from the front. He's been wounded multiple times. He's watched good men die because their officers were incompetent and their training was inadequate. And he has been thinking about this problem for 20 years. How do you create soldiers who can survive the modern battlefield? How do you train men to think under fire? The answer comes to him in the most unlikely place, not on a battlefield, but in the quiet hills of Kent, at a place called Shorncliffe Barracks. In 1803, Moore is given command of a brigade and the permission to train them however he wants. It's a test. The establishment thinks he'll fail. They think his soft methods will produce weak soldiers. They're about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Moore arrives at Shorncliffe and he immediately breaks every rule in the book. First, he bans flogging for minor offenses. In an army where men are whipped bloody for having dirty boots, this is revolutionary. His fellow officers think he's lost his mind. They tell him his men will become undisciplined rabble. Moore doesn't care. He knows that fear produces obedience, sure, but it doesn't produce thinking soldiers. And the thinking soldiers are what he needs. Next, he does something even more radical. He starts teaching his soldiers to read and write. Not just officers, regular enlisted men, privates, the lowest ranks. He sets up schools in the barracks. He brings in teachers. He encourages his men to study tactics, to understand strategy, to read about the battles they might fight. The aristocratic officer corps is horrified. Why would a common soldier need to read? What's next? Teaching them Latin and the Greek. But Moore understands something they don't. A soldier who can read orders can act independently. A soldier who understands tactics can make intelligent decisions when his officer is dead and the chaos reigns. But Moore's most important innovation is physical training. Not the mechanical drill that dominated British military practice, but actual physical fitness. He takes his men on long route marches across the Kent countryside, not in neat columns on roads, but spread out across fields and through forests. He teaches them to use terrain, to take cover, to move quickly, to think about positioning. His light infantry men run whilst other British soldiers march. They climb hills. They wade through streams. They learn to move silently. They practice firing from prone positions, from behind trees, from broken ground. This is completely alien to traditional British tactics where men stood shoulder to shoulder in the open and traded volleys. Moore creates skirmishing drills unlike anything in the British Army. His men practice fighting in pairs. One man fires whilst his partner reloads and moves. They learn to communicate with hand signals so they don't give away positions. They train to spot enemy officers and target them first. This targeting of officers is considered ungentlemanly warfare by traditional standards. But more is practical, not romantic. Killing enemy leaders breaks enemy formations. But here is what makes more truly revolutionary. He teaches his men why they're learning these things. He explains tactics to them. He walks them through scenarios. What do you do if your formation is broken? What if you're cut off from the main force? What if you need to delay a superior enemy force? Traditional British training never asked soldiers to think about these questions. You just obeyed orders. But Moore's light infantrymen are learning to be autonomous warriors. The transformation is remarkable. Men who arrived as typical British recruit scout and the mechanical become confident and capable. They start to take pride in themselves. They develop unit cohesion not based on fear of punishment, but on mutual respect. Moore insists his officers eat with their men, sleep in similar conditions, share hardships. He breaks down the rigid class barriers that define the British Army. Not completely. Of course, this is still 1800, but he moves the needle further than anyone thought possible. His officers are carefully selected. Moore doesn't want aristocratic gentlemen who bought their commissions and think command is their birthright. He wants men who can lead, who can think, who care about their soldiers. He mentors them personally. He teaches them that their job isn't to give orders and watch from safety. Their job is to develop their men, to earn their trust, to lead by example. Word starts to spread through the British Army about the strange training happening at Shorncliffe. Some officers are intrigued, men are dismissive. But then something happens that changes everything. Napoleon invades Spain. The Peninsular War begins. And Britain needs every effective soldier it can find. Moore's light infantry brigades are sent to Spain as part of a British expeditionary force. It's their first real test. Will these experimental units perform under fire? Or will traditional officers' predictions of disaster prove correct? The answer comes quickly. Moore's light infantrymen excel. They move faster than regular British infantry. They can screen the main army's movements, preventing French cavalry from reconnaissance. They can hold positions against superior numbers using terrain and intelligent positioning. They adapt to situations without needing constant orders from above. The French have never faced anything like this. French tactics rely on overwhelming force, rapid movement, intimidation. The skirmishers are good, but they're used to facing rigid British lines that are easy to predict. Moore's light infantry fight differently. They're everywhere and nowhere. They use Spanish terrain brilliantly. They fall back when pressured but never break. They inflict casualties out of proportion to their numbers. But the campaign goes badly overall not because of Moore's tactics, but because of strategic failures at higher levels. The Spanish armies that were supposed to support the British collapse. Napoleon himself under Spain with overwhelming force. The British Army under Moore's overall command now finds itself outnumbered and in danger of being cut off and destroyed. Moore makes the brutal decision to retreat. It's winter. The army must march across mountains in freezing conditions with the French in pursuit. It's one of the most grueling retreats in military history. This is where Moore's training truly shows its value. Whilst much of the British Army struggles with discipline during the nightmare retreat, Moore's light infantry units maintain cohesion. They serve as the rearguard, fighting constant skirmishing actions to slow French pursuit. They cover the retreat of the main army. They hold mountain passes against French cavalry. They suffer terribly in the cold and the hunger like everyone else, but they remain effective fighting units. Traditional British regiments that haven't received Moore's training fall apart during the retreat. Men desert. Units disintegrate. But the light infantry hold together because Moore taught them to think, to understand their purpose, to trust their officers and each other. The retreat ends at Corunna, a port city where the British Army hopes to evacuate by sea. But the French arrive before all the ships do. There has to be a battle. Moore knows this is likely his last fight. He's sick, exhausted, and the weight of the campaign's failures haunts him, but he has to buy time for his army to escape. On the 16th of January, 1809, the Battle of Corunna begins. Moore commands brilliantly. He positions his forces to maximize defensive advantage. His light infantry skirmish with French advance forces, giving him time to set up proper positions. When the main French assault comes, British lines hold firm. Moore is everywhere on the battlefield encouraging men, adjusting positions, responding to threats. His presence inspires the troops. This is the kind of leader he trained his officers to be. Visible, confident, competent. Then disaster strikes. A French cannonball hits near Moore. The impact doesn't strike him directly, but the concussion and the shrapnel tear into his left shoulder and the chest. The wound is catastrophic. He's carried from the field. As the battle continues to rage, surgeons examine him and they realize there's no more hope. The damage is too severe. Moore is dying. In his final hours, Moore asks repeatedly about the battle. Did his men hold? Is the army safe? Can they evacuate? He's told that yes, the British lines held. The French assault was repelled. The evacuation can proceed. Moore's last words are about his men and the mission. Hideous, believing his army will escape, which it does. He's buried, wrapped in a military cloak, in the ramparts of Corunna. There's no more time for a proper funeral. The army must get to the ships. The immediate reaction in Britain is mixed. The retreat is seen by men as a failure. Moore's death is mourned, but some blame him for the campaign's disasters, even though the strategic failures were beyond his control. It seems like his innovations might die with him, dismissed as the eccentric experiments of a fallen general. But something unexpected happens. The soldiers who trained under Moore and survived the retreat, they remember. They tell stories about their general, about how he made them feel valued, about how his training saved their lives, and crucially, some of Moore's protégés survived. Officers he trained and mentored. Men like Arthur Wellesley, who will become the Duke of Wellington and eventually defeat Napoleon. Men who understand what Moore was building and are determined to continue his work. Wellington, in particular, recognizes the value of Moore's light infantry tactics. When Wellington takes command in the peninsula, he doesn't abandon Moore's innovations. He expands them. Wellington creates dedicated rifle regiments trained in Moore's methods. The famous 95 T8 rifles become legends. They wear the green jackets Moore designed. They use the tactics Moore invented. They fight as skirmishers and sharpshooters. They operate independently, often miles ahead of the main army. They earn the nickname the Sweeps because they sweep the field ahead of the British advance. And they terrify the French. Moore's influence spreads beyond the rifles. Wellington applies Moore's principles about officer education and the soldier training across his army. He emphasizes physical fitness and the practical fieldcraft. He trusts his junior officers to make decisions. He expects initiative at all levels. The British army that fights through the Peninsular War and eventually wins at Waterloo is fundamentally different from the army that entered Spain in 1808. It is Moore's army built on his principles, trained in his methods. But the real test of Moore's legacy comes later, in ways he could never have imagined. As warfare evolves through the 19th and the 20th centuries, Moore's core insights become more relevant, not less. The idea that soldiers should be educated and trusted. The concept of small unit tactics. The emphasis on physical fitness and the mental resilience. The practice of officers leading from the front and earning respect rather than demanding it through rank. These ideas become foundational to modern military training. When the British Army creates commando units in World War II, they look back to Moore's principles. When special forces develop globally after the war, they're built on concepts Moore pioneered. Small teams operating independently, soldiers who can think and adapt, emphasis on intelligence and initiative over rigid obedience, intensive physical training, careful selection and the elite standards. This is Moore's legacy. He created the template for modern special operations. But there's an even deeper legacy, one that goes beyond specific tactics. Moore proved that soldiers fight better when they're respected, educated, and trusted. This seems obvious now, but it was radical in his time. Armies had been built on fear and rigid discipline for thousands of years. Moore showed there was a better way. Not a soft way. His training was brutally demanding, but a way that recognized soldiers as intelligent human beings capable of growth and excellence. Think about what he was fighting against. The entire British military establishment believed soldiers were basically interchangeable parts in a machine. They didn't need to think, just obey. They didn't need to be fit, just able to stand in line. They didn't need to understand tactics, just follow orders. And most importantly, they needed to be controlled through fear, because without harsh discipline, they'd become useless. Moore looked at the system and decided it was wrong. Not just ineffective, but morally wrong. He understood something profound about human nature. people perform better when they understand their purpose. They're more resilient when they're part of a cohesive team. They're more creative and adaptive when they're encouraged to think. They're more loyal when they're respected. These insights apply far beyond military training. They're principles of effective leadership in any context. The tragedy is that Moore never lived to see any of this. He died believing his campaign was a failure. He couldn't have known that his tactical innovations would help Wellington win the Peninsular War. He couldn't have imagined that his training methods would become standard across the British Army and influence military practice globally. He died thinking he was just one general amongst men, not realizing he'd changed everything. There's something deeply moving about this. Moore was driven by duty and by genuine care for his soldiers. He wasn't seeking glory or fame. He was trying to solve practical problems to keep his men alive, to make them effective. His innovations came from compassion as much as from tactical genius. He looked at how soldiers were treated and he thought they deserved better. He looked at how they were trained and he thought they could be more capable. And he dedicated his career to proving it. His death at Chorona is remembered in British military tradition not just as a tactical event, but as a symbolic moment. The general who cared about his men, who trained them and trusted them, who transformed them into elite soldiers dying whilst buying them time to escape. It's a narrative of sacrifice and duty that resonates with military culture. The fact that Moore's last questions were about his men's safety, not his own legacy, cements his reputation as the ideal of selfless leadership. What made Moore special wasn't just his tactical innovations, though those were significant. It was his understanding that military effectiveness ultimately depends on human factors. Equipment matters, tactics matter, but what really matters is the quality of the individual soldier and the cohesion of the unit. Everything Moore did was aimed at improving those human factors. Better training to make soldiers more capable, better leadership to make them more confident, better unit culture to make them more cohesive, better treatment to make them more motivated. This human-centered approach to military effectiveness was ahead of its time. It anticipated concepts from organizational psychology and leadership theory that wouldn't be formalized for over a century. Moore understood intuitively what research would later prove that people perform better when they're respected, when they understand their purpose, when they're given autonomy within clear parameters, when they're part of cohesive teams with strong leadership. The modern military term mission command describes a command philosophy where superiors communicate intent and the desired outcomes, but subordinates determine how to achieve them. This is exactly what Moore was building at Shorncliffe. He trained his men to understand tactical situations and to make appropriate decisions. He trusted them to execute missions without constant supervision. Mission command is now standard in Western militaries. Moore was practicing it before it had a name. Moore's influence even extends to how we think about military ethics. He insisted his soldiers treat civilians respectfully. He prohibited looting. He punished unnecessary violence. He taught that soldiers represented Britain and they should act accordingly. This concern for maintaining ethical standards even in the chaos of war was unusual for his era. It anticipated modern military codes of conduct. Moore's personal character contributed enormously to his effectiveness and the legacy. He was brave in combat, wounded multiple times leading from the front. He was intellectually curious, constantly reading and thinking about military problems. He was dedicated to his profession, never marrying because he felt it would distract from his military duties. He was principled, willing to advocate for unpopular ideas when he thought they were right. And he genuinely cared about his soldiers not as abstract statistics, but as individual human beings whose lives mattered. This combination of personal qualities made him an inspiring leader. His soldiers knew he'd never order them into danger he wouldn't face himself. They knew he cared whether they lived or died. They knew he was working constantly to make them better soldiers, not for his own glory, but for their survival. This created loyalty and the respect that went far beyond fear of punishment. Men followed Moore because they believed in him. After Moore's death, there was real danger his innovations would be abandoned. Some officers argued the special conditions of the peninsula didn't apply elsewhere. Some claimed Moore's success was personal charisma, not replicable methods. Some simply wanted to return to comfortable traditions. But Wellington's continued support and the demonstrated effectiveness of more trained units ensured the innovations survived. The Peninsular War became a laboratory for Moore's tactics. As the war continued year after year, British forces incorporated more and more of his methods. By the time Wellington invaded France in 1814, the British army was unrecognizable from the force that entered Spain in 1808. It was faster, more flexible, better trained, more aggressive. It fought with initiative and confidence. It was Moore's vision made real across an entire army. This transformation contributed directly to Napoleon's defeat. At Waterloo in 1815, Wellington commanded British, Dutch, and the German forces against Napoleon's return. The British troops' steadiness under pressure, their ability to form squares rapidly when threatened by cavalry, their effective skirmishing, all these factors contributed to victory, all descended from Moore's reforms. So when we talk about Napoleon's defeat, we should remember Moore's role. Not on the battlefield, he was dead by then, but in creating the army that defeated Napoleon. The century after Moore saw his ideas spread globally. As European armies professionalized, they studied the British military system and the adopted elements of it. The emphasis on light infantry became universal. The concept of specialized elite units became standard. By 1900, armies worldwide were more like Moore's vision than like the 18th century armies he'd reformed. The world wars of the 20th century vindicated Moore's approaches even more dramatically. The trenches of World War I showed that rigid tactics and the unthinking obedience led to catastrophic casualties. Armies that encouraged initiative, that developed small unit tactics, that empowered junior leaders, these armies were more effective. World War II accelerated the trend. Special forces, commandos, rangers, these units were explicitly built on principles Moore pioneered. Small teams operating independently behind enemy lines. Soldiers trained to think and adapt. Emphasis on physical fitness and the mental toughness. Initiative valued over blind obedience. The SAS, the commandos, the rangers, all descendants of Moore's light infantry philosophy. Modern special operations forces are even more clearly Moore's heirs. Elite selection processes that test not just physical ability but problem-solving and stress resistance. Brutal training that builds both capability and the unit cohesion. Small team operations requiring intelligent decision-making. Mission command philosophy. Cross-training so individuals can perform multiple roles. This is Moore's vision realized with 21st century technology. But Moore's influence extends beyond elite units. Modern basic training in professional militaries worldwide incorporates his principles. Physical fitness is foundational. Soldiers are taught to think, to understand their role in larger operations, to make decisions under pressure. Leadership development starts from day one. Unit cohesion is deliberately built. There's also Moore's influence on leadership development outside the military. His principles about respecting individuals, developing their capabilities, building cohesive teams, leading by example, these translate to any organizational context. Modern leadership theory emphasizes many of the same concepts Moore practiced. Business schools teach that effective leaders develop their people, empower them to make decisions, build organizational cultures based on trust and the shared purpose. That's what Moore did at Shorncliffe. He'd be completely comfortable in a modern MBA program discussing leadership and the organizational effectiveness. His insights weren't just military, they were fundamental truths about human performance and the motivation. So Moore's legacy extends far beyond military history. He demonstrated fundamental truths about human potential, learning, leadership, and the organizational effectiveness. He showed that people perform better when treated as capable individuals rather than interchangeable parts. This insight has transformed not just militaries, but organizations of all types. Yet Moore himself would probably be surprised by his lasting impact. He saw himself as a practical soldier solving immediate problems. He wasn't trying to revolutionize military thought. He was trying to keep his soldiers alive and make them effective. The fact that his practical solutions embody deep truths about human nature that was almost accidental. There's a lesson here about innovation. The most transformative changes often come from people solving specific problems with fresh approaches, not from grand theorists designing perfect systems. Moore didn't start with a theory and implement it. He started with problems, experimented with solutions, kept what worked, built a system empirically. As we reach the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on why Moore matters today. We live in an era of rapid technological change. Warfare looks completely different than in Moore's time. Yet Moore's core insights remain valid. Human factors still determine military effectiveness: training, leadership, cohesion, morale. These still matter more than technology. Moore also matters because his story is inspiring. Here was someone who saw a better way, who faced enormous institutional resistance, who persisted anyway because he believed in his vision and he cared about his soldiers. He succeeded not through political maneuvering or personal ambition, but through demonstrated results. His methods worked. His soldiers became elite. His tactics succeeded in combat. This made his critics irrelevant. Today, just as your vision is starting to be vindicated, today wondering if you'd failed, today on a desperate battlefield buying time for your men to escape. This is the stuff of legend. But it's not just legend, it's history. Moore really did these things. His sacrifice was real. His impact was real. His legacy endures. So when you hear about special forces, about elite military units, about professional soldiers trained to think and fight effectively, remember John Moore. When you hear about leadership development, about empowering people, about building high-performance teams through respect and training rather than fear, remember Moore. When you hear about innovation in the face of institutional resistance, about someone who saw a better way and proved it worked, remember Moore. He created the blueprint for modern military professionalism. He showed that soldiers are a people, not machines, and that treating them as people makes them more effective, not less. He demonstrated that thinking, educated soldiers can accomplish things rigid automatons cannot. And he hated all this over 200 years ago in an era when these ideas were revolutionary and controversial. He looked at the military system of his time and he saw how it could be better. He had the courage to challenge that system and the competence to prove his alternative worked. That's why we remember him. That's why his legacy endures. That's why John Moore, though dead at Corunna in 1809, still influences how soldiers are trained and led today. His story reminds us that one person with a better idea, with the courage to implement it and the skill to prove it works, can change institutions and influence the world for centuries. Moore didn't set out to revolutionize warfare. He set out to make his soldiers more effective and keep them alive. But by focusing on that practical goal with intelligence and dedication, he changed military history. If you've enjoyed discovering how one Scottish general's radical compassion and tactical genius created the template for every special forces unit on Earth today, give this a like and stick around for more stories about the forgotten innovators who shaped our world. Drop a comment telling us which military innovator you'd like to hear about next. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about famous battles and the great generals, it is about the ideas and the innovations that change how we think and act. And those ideas often come from people who care deeply about solving real problems for real people. John Moore was one of those people, and he was still benefiting from his vision today.